Hello and welcome to Personable, a podcast focused on speaking to the world's best, enabling you to become the best that you can be. Today I'm honored to be joined by Olu Brown. Olu is the founder and lead pastor of the Impact United Methodist Church, and he is now running for the governor of Georgia. So Olu, I feel incredibly honored to be able to speak to you today. I wondered if you could take me on the journey of why you initially became close to God and wanted to become a pastor.
Well, thank you, Harvey, for having me on your podcast. I was born in a town called Lufkin, small town in Texas, and grew up in a great community of elders, people who I knew from childhood up to adulthood, and each of them were a part of what we would call that village community. And so faith and spirituality were a part of my early years. My father was a Presbyterian pastor, and although we didn't live together, we spent quite a bit of time, and he pastored in some of the largest cities in the country, Newark, New Jersey, and Los Angeles, California. And so not only did I have this spiritual upbringing, but also got an opportunity to travel various parts of the world and be exposed to people from different backgrounds, different cultures, different traditions, different ethnicities. But when I was a young teenager, there was a new church in our hometown, and the pastor gave me an opportunity to help lead worship. And I never will forget, I was probably all of 13 or 14 years old, and it's something called a pastoral prayer. And I said that prayer after I'd written it out word for word. And then we went home like we always do, and there was a knock on the door, and it was the opportunity of a lifetime. The pastor of that church asked my mother if it would be okay for him, being me, to help him out on Sunday morning. So if you imagine this, teenager helping out on Sunday morning, still living a regular teenage life, but that pastor is still a mentor in the faith to me to this very day. And it helped me to understand my call to ministry. And I accepted that when I was a senior in high school. So my journey went straight through from high school to undergrad and then to what we call biblical study training. In the U.S., it's seminary. And so that brought me to Atlanta, Georgia to go to seminary. And it all started when I was a teenager and a preteen, being raised by people who helped me to, I believe, hear the voice of God.
I think it's fascinating, speaking to church leaders, because from my perspective growing up, I was raised Catholic. And so I'd look at church leaders as these sort of figures that myself and the rest of my community would look up to. But I think something that people often forget is that although we're all created imago Dei in the image of God, at the same time, we're also human. And so we're bound to, to sin and to make mistakes. I was wondering if you were the perfect child, or if you were ever naughty growing up, and with that other tendency, why that still made you want to give back and to enter the church from such a young age.
Yeah, I believe it's the church, but there's another C word that we often don't talk about when it comes to the church, and that's the community. So I believe blending the church with the community really goes hand in hand. So I was fortunate to have a loving community of people who understood this is still a kid. He's a teenager, and he's going to make the mistakes that every other teenager makes. But I was never shamed. I was never set aside. I was never told that God doesn't have a call or a purpose for your life. So ultimately, the blending of what I got in the church with the community helped me to understand, as you said, none of us are perfect. And it really gave me a deeper understanding of grace, a deeper understanding of mercy, which I believe in the ministry that I've had over the years has been demonstrated because I've experienced it myself.
I want to go back to that idea of community, but first of all, it's tough to believe from someone that's not as religious as yourself that it's a dream for a 5-year-old kid to one day be a pastor. Was there anything else that you ever wanted to be, or was it always, I've been surrounded by this as a young kid. I've seen my dad do it. I've seen my family do it. I'm bound by this community. This is what I want to do.
Well, it really wasn't the family business as it can be, fortunately or unfortunately for some folks. My undergrad degree is in elementary education. So my education training is really to be an educator. And my mother was a fourth grade school teacher for most of her career. So I guess I followed in both of my parents' footsteps, my father as a pastor and my mother as a teacher. But people who knew me from early years would not be surprised that I'm two things, a preacher and a politician, because I've expressed passion for both from an early age, and also business and entrepreneurship. My brother and I had a lawn mowing business, and we were thriving entrepreneurs as teenagers. So I had a pretty well-rounded life. And when I think about my adulthood, even being in ministry and the type of ministry that I was in, planting a new church is very entrepreneurial. It's starting from ground up. It's raising support. It's raising awareness. It's the marketing. It's the negotiations. It's all of those things that you would do in starting a business. So I think a reflection of my life as a pastor, now as a politician, is really grounded in my beginning and being nurtured and never being told what I couldn't do by the community. And when I say community, I also mean my family. And I just had a really great experience of people who loved me, gave me opportunity to take risks, to make a ton of mistakes. But that's how, you can be this 5 or 6 year old projecting into the future about what you want to be.
I think it's both an honor and it's a great thing to have an amazing community of people around you. But both within Christianity and outside of it,
yes,
not all communities are genuinely good-willed, even though they may seem on the surface. That's why you have things like cults, for example, in
yes,
which people enter with open arms. They're taken in, feel like they're loved, and then step by step, they're taken to do things that they wouldn't have initially wanted to do, or might not even be conscious that they're doing. Sort of on that point for people listening in, and I'm sure you've probably given similar recommendations to people. If they could join your church, great, but not everyone geographically around the world can. How should people go about finding community that they know has the best intentions?
Well, interesting about my journey, about 2 years ago, I retired from pastoral ministry. So a part of my resume and bio is a founder and former pastor, now going into politics, but also as a business owner, as a coach and facilitator and trainer. But even though I'm not pastoring full time, people still ask me that question. And I work with a lot of faith leaders. But I think as it relates to finding genuine community, finding and connecting with people online or in person who you identify with. It's something we say often, people who get you, who understand you. You don't have to explain yourself. And most importantly, you don't have to become someone you're not. I think any community that wants you to become something you're not probably isn't the community for you. Now, I'm not talking about becoming sharper and better at certain things that you need to work on, such as procrastination or becoming more forgiving. I think every community should encourage you to do that. But when it tries to fundamentally change your DNA and who you are, it's, as you mentioned earlier, the image of God. And when we think about the spiritual journey, in particular from a Christian background, we're created in the image of God. Who would want to change that? You're already who God intended you to be, and finding community that accepts that. And the good thing is, for some people, community may not be in person. It's a virtual community. You mentioned how you communicate with your family, but your family aren't physically with you, but you're still in community with them. And the same can be true as it relates to faith relationships.
A big trend in the last 10 years has been the rise in the growth of personal growth. So people wanting to better themselves, whether mentally and spiritually, or wanting to get fitter, or to be a better person for their family, for their community, and the people around them. But you just said something, and I referred to earlier, Imago Dei, in terms of being in the image of God, and that we're already built, not perfect, but rather in the image of God. And so are those two things not contradicting in any sense? Wanting to become a better version of yourself versus already being made a certain way. And so on that point, if that is true, if you are already this thing, why I feel like I would join a community to want to change. I feel like I would have a calling and be like, I have done XYZ, or I feel like I can get better at this, and I need to open myself up. And when you do that, you become vulnerable and so more susceptible to change for the better or for the worse.
Yeah, I agree. You know, I know people listen to your podcast around the world, but here in the United States of America, we're in the midst of football season, headed towards the Super Bowl, as what we, demonstrated as football. And one of the players for the Philadelphia Eagles, who's in the playoffs, was on the sideline during the game reading a book. And it was a self-help book that became a number one, or probably close to number one seller, because here's this NFL player reading this improvement book while he's playing a football game. And he owned it. He owned being a person who is interested in improving himself. And so I don't think the two are opposed to each other, being in community with people and also working on yourself. Whenever you introduce yourself to diversity, a couple of things will happen. It shows a mirror to yourself, and you're able to see yourself in a different image. It shouldn't be a negative image, but it should show you spaces and places where you can improve. And I think that becomes your self-help responsibility personally. But it also gives you a reflection through the mirror of a broader community and how your unique gifts can contribute and add value. So the two work hand in hand. Being in community with people helps you understand the things that you may need to work on individually, but it also helps you to see how your unique gifts contribute to the betterment of that broader community. And that's a blessing, and it's really, I believe, what we should all be aspiring to do and to be a part of.
One thing the last point I want to sort of ask on this before moving on to something else is this: you've mentioned this calling to God, right? Yes. God, and it's a common thing that people talk about in terms of God asking me to do something. Could you talk about that a bit more? Is that a literal thing? Is it a sign you see? Or are people just following their gut and doing what they believe their destiny to be? Is that God's calling?
Well, you mentioned your spiritual background in the Catholic Church. And so we both have what we call this Bible, or the canon. And we know in the Catholic tradition, you include the Apocrypha. In the Protestant tradition, where my faith was rooted, which is still Christianity, we don't have the Apocrypha. It's more of what we call the Protestant Bible, but it's all enriching, and it all is a wonderful experience. And when you read the Bible, whatever version you read, there is this part we call the Old Testament. And there are a lot of these call stories in the Old Testament. And one I identify with the most is the book of Jeremiah, the prophet. He was what we call a major prophet. There are these minor and major prophets in the Old Testament. And Jeremiah begins with his call story. And it's enriching because it says, before I was born, God knew me. And God called me, and God set me apart for a special plan and a special purpose. And I think a lot of people struggle, whether they're in ministry or any other aspect of life, of feeling loved, of feeling wanted, of feeling as if their life has a purpose. So for me, when I say I'm called into ministry, it's universal, because I believe we're all called to do something. My expression happens to be helping lead faith communities, now transitioning to being a politician, but I'm still helping people. And I believe in every work, every walk of life, every profession, you've been called to do something. And at the end of the day, it should be helping other people and making our world a better place. So Jeremiah is the expression of hearing God's voice that I mostly identify with.
When you decided to start your church, I'm sure that's a rarity within itself, but there are lots of churches throughout the world. But you managed to use, I don't know what strategy you used, but some form of growth strategy to go from a tiny congregation to an enormous one. Could you take me on the journey of how you went about accomplishing that, and using your background and interest in entrepreneurship to go from having something small and making it really large?
Well, very grateful that I was a part of a denomination called the United Methodist Church. And so around the world, there are a lot of expressions of what we call the Methodist Church, or Methodism. And the particular one that I've been a part of is United Methodist. And thankfully, our denomination was willing to invest in me financially. So from the business world, they were angel investors. And I'll be honest with you, without that angel investment initially, our church would have still been successful in what we consider success in church planning, but it would have taken a little bit longer. But thankfully, there were initial financial investments from the denomination, but it was still primarily on me and a team of 25 volunteers that we started with. And I'll be honest with you, Harvey, it felt like that teenage kid with a lawnmower going from door to door asking, can I mow your lawn? And so you never get out of the entrepreneurial 101 foundation lessons in any walk of life, because you literally had to build relationships and partnerships with the business community, with the political community. There were other churches around us, from Catholic churches to Presbyterian churches to Baptist churches and Methodist churches. And so we had to get to know each of those individuals. And we started in a public school. So that meant we had to develop relationships with the supervisors in the school district, with the principal, with the teachers. And so you're constantly managing relationships. You're constantly marketing and telling people why they should choose you over the 20 other churches that are in walking distance. And you're also building the internal team to help you focus on missions and outreach, music and worship. And it's almost like you're holding 20 different balls in your hand and you're juggling them at the same time, but you're very clear on why you exist. And so the tagline for our church, and it still is the tagline, although I'm not the pastor anymore, is doing church differently. And that was our vision and that was our tagline. So people would always come to our church because they wanted an experience that was different than what they had experienced before in faith community. Or we also attracted a lot of people who never had any background in faith community. And so this was a first-time introduction to Christianity, and it really worked well for a lot of people. But to be honest with you, it was entrepreneurship 101, but in the faith community, we would call it evangelism 101.
That's a nice way of saying it. I really like that, doing church differently. I think that's a really cool. Maybe I'll call this doing podcasting differently or something.
Yeah,
Steal your tagline. I think
cool.
you have to have something about you. Like, I think with founders these days, with the rise of social media, there's been a big trend in following the founder, their story, and why that's called them to do something. I always had the belief in something that, if I just do something I'm interested in, I'll do it well. But if the passion is behind that and you can see it, that's where you go from good to great. And I feel like that's what you've done, as you're incredibly passionate about this community. Why do you think, you're always selling? You have to sell, even as a church leader, whether it's selling monetary wise or selling with their time and attention. Why do you think that people took to you? They want church differently, but every church is different. They have a different name, they have a different background, they have a different pastor. But there must have been something about you and about the way you went about things that made people want to tell all of their loved ones, Olu Brown is the man. He's the guy that we want to listen to. He's the guy that we want to tell us stories, to help with my faith and push me closer to God.
Yeah. A few things. Brene Brown, she's a professor at University of Houston, written a ton of books, and one of her ongoing themes is authenticity and vulnerability. And I think as a person, historically, I've embodied those two. Struggle with it often, but as a leader and an upfront leader, people will consistently say he can be vulnerable and he's very authentic. And so when we started our church and we had these 25 individuals, everything we did flowed out of those values of starting small groups that met in community and coffee shops. So we weren't asking people to come to a building. And so we were going to them, and that's being authentic. And even when they came to worship, it wasn't a traditional church building. It was a school auditorium. And so it was much more casual. There weren't all of the symbols of faith that they had seen on TV or experienced in their own faith communities. And so it was really disarming in a sense, to where not only could I come, but I also feel this is a place for me to bring a family member who may be struggling with their faith, or a person, unfortunately, who may have been hurt before by the hands of the church. So all of those things put together, and I'll be honest with you, although my name was typically, on the marquee or those types of things, it was really a team effort. I think great leaders know what they do well, and they also know what they don't do well. And so self-awareness in those areas has been vital for my leadership. And there are a ton of things I don't do well. And thankfully, we had a team that built out the things that I didn't do well, but also I was able to do the things that they didn't do well. So it was a pretty well-balanced team. And at the end of the day, we reached people in person and we reached quite a bit of people virtually.
I think there's I'm going to completely botch this stat, but there's something like, if you listen to something, you remember like, I don't know, like 10% of it. And then if you speak it, you remember 20%. And if you write it, you remember 30% or something. I don't know what the exact statistics are, but the point is to say that, when someone says something, someone says 100 words, they're only going to remember X% of it. And then if they're not attentive, they'll probably listen to none of it. Like if you gave someone an hour-long speech and you asked them to name 5 things you mentioned, unless they were attentive and interested in it, it's not really going to go in. And so I feel like in order to get someone to, again, going back to this social media age, the whole thing people are aiming to do is get them to engage in some way.
Yes.
They need to like, they need to comment, they need to share. Otherwise, a social media post doesn't do well. And it's the exact same in real life, that if people aren't engaging, if they're not singing, if they're not saying, the church lines, if they're not interacting in some way, if they're not telling their family about it, if they're not coming, if they're not telling their friends, they're not engaging. And so they fall away and they lose that connection, at least consciously, with God or, with whatever religious figure they believe in. And so I'm sure that you've been able to tell or learn to tell a very compelling story. I was wondering if you ever had any structures or ways of idea generation to going about the stories you would tell.
Yeah. Well, growing up, in particular in the African-American community, my mother, as an educator and being surrounded by educators, they were gifted storytellers. And there was this dramatization my mother would do of an older African-American woman coming through a civil rights era in the United States of America, and even pre-civil rights era. And it dawned on me later, hearing her tell that story. But not only my mother, my aunt was very in-depth in literature. And so we would go to poetry reading, and we would have to hear literature at an early age. And all of these were stories wrapped in literature. And so when I began to develop my voice as a speaker, I would pull on their voices and the experiences that I heard. And not only from my family and community, but other great orators that I had valued and appreciated over the world, throughout the world over the years. And of course, one of my favorite, Martin Luther King Jr. and others. And so all of those mixtures of people and voices and great teachers that I had in debate and mentors who helped me hear and develop my voice. And the thing that I tell people often, and this goes back to one of Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outlier, it talks about practice. And so if you look at my life and what has helped me a great bit today is practice. And that's practicing speaking. That's practicing all of the parts of debate and being an orator. And so those have helped me to craft the story to a place that hopefully people are engaged and they listen. And like you said, they're able to apply it.
So I think I've asked you a lot of questions about your background, and now your next big venture. Why run for governor of Georgia?
Yeah. It is a natural next step for me, professionally and personally, because my entire life has been about what we call servant leadership. We often want to be leaders, but very few want to be servant leaders. And I think servant leaders are concerned about people, they're concerned about community, and they're concerned about positive outcomes that impact the majority of people as opposed to a minority group or a specialized aspect of community. And so throughout my life, I've always been politically engaged. I've always been astute on political and community issues. And my life as a pastor has been more than Sunday morning from a Christian standpoint. It's been about Monday through Saturday. So here's a quick example. When we had an opportunity to buy property for this church that we started, because we had been worshiping in a middle school for years, we had three examples for our realtor. We wanted a former warehouse, we wanted a former school, or a former retail space. We did not want a traditional church building because we wanted to be a part of the economic development of the community. So we bought a 76,000 square foot dilapidated warehouse. People were living in the warehouse. There were ugly words written on the walls, and it was a blight to the community. We took that property that no one else wanted, and now not only is it a worshiping faith community, it's an economic driver for the city. It hosts special events. It partners with wonderful groups like United Way. It hosts job training and job readiness. And it is now a place that attracts people as opposed to a place that formerly people would run from. And because we made that investment, other businesses have also made an investment. And from a political standpoint, it's a voting site for the state of Georgia, where people now can come vote for their elected officials. So becoming a politician simply is me putting that word on paper. But if I think about my entire life's journey, I've always been, in some shape or form, a politician.
I think there's always that question, right? There's a famous question in the entrepreneurship world: sell me this pen, right?
Yes.
And the people that will do that unsuccessfully will say, oh, well, this is the nicest pen you've ever seen. I mean, look at the tip, look at the ink. It's, the only ink in the world like this, and blah, 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 blah. And they'll give the same pitch to anyone, depending on, it doesn't matter who they are. They're just going to say, I think this, and so you should think this as well. And maybe it will work, but most of the time it's not. But actually, the better answer to those questions is, right, give me your phone number. Oh, you don't have a pen. Or some other example, you find out basically where the deficit is in that person's life. Yes. Figure out why they would need a pen. And if they don't need a pen, don't sell them a pen, right?
Yep.
You figure out what is going wrong or not having in order to sell them that. And so I'm sure you're, very qualified and you've got an amazing background. Voters will like you, and, you've got examples of ways in which you've done good for your community. And so hopefully that would extrapolate to do that for the whole state. But I would want to ask you that same question. What is the deficit in Georgia? What's going wrong? Why is there need for change? And then why are you the right person to fill that gap?
So our website is listeningtogeorgians.org, and you can also reach it at olubrownforgovernor.org. But the reason we're using this tagline, listeningtogeorgians.org, is because we're taking a different approach than most politicians. Most politicians, going back to that pen example, would come to you and say, here's what I believe, and here's what I think you need. Our approach is different. I want to know who you are, and I really don't have all the answers to what you need, but if you will take a moment or two and share with me your concerns, then I will have more knowledge on how to address those. So we're traveling the state in person and virtually, asking these three questions. What do you love about Georgia? What are your concerns about Georgia? And what would you change? So you can imagine with the primary being in May of 2026, we have more than 2 years worth of information from Georgians about what they care about the most, what they're concerned about, and what they want to change. And of course, things that I'm consistently hearing are around affordable health care, around making sure education is equal for all children, regardless of the zip code that they live in, ensuring that crime is lowered and that we feel safe in our communities wherever we live, addressing the needs of women's rights and protecting those, and making sure that women feel as if their rights aren't on the legislative block, and that as a human being, they should have control over their bodies and be able to make decisions for their bodies. And so these are some of the consistent concerns that I'm hearing, but I'm also hearing things that people feel are going very well. Right now, Georgia is running a surplus in our state's resources, which is a great blessing. We're leading one of the leading states in the country in making movies. We also have a major scholarship program that allows millions of our kids to be educated in our higher education systems. So we have a lot of things that are working well in Georgia. And as the next governor, we'll keep those things going. But we also have some deficits in some areas. And because of my background, because of my willingness to be a collaborative leader and work across the aisles with every person from every party, we'll get stuff done and we'll make sure we can focus on those issues that oftentimes go overlooked, like some of those that I just mentioned.
I want to play devil's advocate, and I don't know if saying devil's advocate is a bad thing to say in front of a pastor.
That's okay.
But is there not a notion in which one could say, if you listen to everyone, you listen to no one? Do you not need to pick a side in some sense?
Well, as a party affiliation, I'm running as a Democrat. So that is me putting a line in the sand to say, based upon how I see myself politically and the values that I identify with the most, I'm a Democrat. Now, that is picking a party. But beyond picking a party, I don't think anyone is 100% anything. In particular in politics, if you want to get things done, you have to work across the aisle. You have to be willing to listen to people who are your competition, people who are your opponents. But here's what we've got to remember. Whether you're elected as a Republican, Democrat, or independent, you serve all of Georgia. And that's the perspective that I would take as the next governor. I am the governor for all Georgians, and all Georgians matter.
Yeah, I actually, I don't know if you have to say this or not because you're obviously running for candidate, but I think on an international scale, it's quite a refreshing thing when hearing a politician say that, irrelevant of their beliefs, because it's the same thing in the UK. I don't think anyone, and I'm speaking to my friends in America, it's the exact same thing. People don't feel like politicians are really serving people anymore, but a lot of them are career politicians or pursuing things for their own agenda rather than actually serving the people. It's like you think about how much money these states have, these economies have, and yet the most basic issues, like I need more money in my pocket, inflation is too high, healthcare costs too much. Like it's ridiculous, and simply like the people actually making the decisions are too gridlocked over issues that they don't actually care about because of the donors and the people backing them and the interests that they have at heart, when in actuality all the people want is actually the same thing, depending if there's a Republican in power or a Democrat in power.
That's it. It's about the people. And I'll be honest with you, at so many levels of politics, people are forgotten about. And often the big donors, the big special interests, and the lobbyists are the ones who get the first opportunity to meet and influence with these elected officials. As the next governor, that would be different for me. I clearly understand what it means to work with lobbyists and special interests and big donors. But remember, I've been a pastor before, and fundraising and working with donors has been something I've done my entire career. And I know what it feels like to have a large donor come and want to spend time with you and to be able to hear that person and, of course, to understand what they need, but also know what it feels like to spend time with the person who hasn't given anything in the life of that faith community, and they have a real need, and put all of our energy to meeting that need. So what people will discover about me as a candidate and as the next governor, that I have a balanced form of leadership, that people, based upon what they give and who they are, doesn't matter more to me than the person who may not have that status or economic ability. All people are important. And as a governor in particular, you need to lead that way. And that's why being a servant leader, more than just saying I'm a leader, is most important to me. You got to be a servant of the people.
I think so. I did some politics in high school. I wouldn't ask what my grades were. I wasn't that good in politics, but nonetheless, I did some politics in high school, and they had this graph. It was basically showing in Congress where Republicans and Democrats would vote, and basically each dot would represent a different voter. So, like, it'd be, if it went more to the side, more red, more to the other side, more blue, and then towards the middle it would sort of, get lighter. And if you look at how they voted on issues like 10 or 15 years ago, much more in the middle, like certain issues. I don't want to bring up any specifically.
Yeah.
Name any issue, and like they would be much more in line over sort of their opinions. However, over the past sort of 5 years, both parties have sort of gone way off to the right and way off to the left in terms of, just in terms of their thinking, but actually in terms of how they're voting. And as you mentioned, needing to go across the aisle to get stuff done, that becomes increasingly harder when people are on complete opposite ends of the scale. Yeah. Obviously, President Donald Trump as well versus Kamala Harris, very divisive. They're two different communities on other ends of the spectrum. How do you see a way to go about stopping divisiveness in Georgia? And do you think it's possible? And is this even a goal that's worth achieving?
Well, and the reason I encourage people to be students of history, in particular for their places of origin, is you will discover there's very little that's new under the sun. And so I'm very much aware. I'm an African American. I've grown up in the South, and I'm seeking to lead and be a governor in a southern state. But when you read the history, we've always been divided. We've always had issues that have caused us to separate, hence a civil war, Jim Crow, civil rights movement. And the opportunity we have in this current generation is to lead closer to the middle and to bring people together around the things that we all cherish, i.e., healthy communities, i.e., children who have opportunity regardless of their skin color, i.e., taking care of our seniors, making sure people are job ready and they have good paying jobs and that they can afford not only to work, but they can also afford to live. And those things cross generation, those things cross gender, those things cross ethnicity. And I believe what I've always said, Georgia, it's time for a new face and a new voice that cares about all Georgians. And if our campaign can help people to focus on those areas of interest, then we can overcome our divisions.
You mentioned divisions, and there are a lot of Christians in the US. I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure the US is a Christian country. But there are still a lot of people from other religions within Georgia. Yes. There are a lot of people that don't believe in God. To what extent do you believe that, were you to become governor of Georgia, that it's fair for those voters for you to use God as the primary influence over your policies versus taking a less, God-orientated perspective when generating your policies for the benefit of all Georgians?
Not that this would make me any better than any other politician in this particular case, but one benefit and one leg up is that I've been trained theologically. And being trained theologically mandates that you have an awareness and appreciation of religions around the world. And so what has happened in Georgia is what's happening throughout the United States of America, is that there is more diversity related to faith interests or non-faith interest. And so what voters would always be able to count on is, although on a piece of paper he checks a box that says Christian, in his practice and his understanding of the world, he appreciates and values all religions and appreciates and values those who would select no religion for their commitment. And that is the benefit that they would have having me as their next governor, as opposed to somebody who is strictly committed to one faith with blinders on and just runs as fast as they can, and everything they do is an output of that strict belief that they have. And that can be very dangerous. And history has shown us so.
I think I wanted to ask you about, were you to become governor, who would you put in your team? What policies would you have? And if you could snap your fingers, name two or three things that would instantly happen. But I feel like they're pointless questions, because I feel like for so many politicians would answer that and give a really trained answer about why XYZ and why XYZ and why XYZ. And then were they to become in power, the voters would be disappointed when a tenth of those things actually occurred.
Yes.
When you're in your campaign and trying to convince people to vote for you, and hopefully that goes through, you become elected, how do you balance, saying that I will do XYZ versus actually getting it done and, keeping that promise to your supporters and your potential voters?
Yeah, it's an ongoing leadership lesson that I've learned throughout the years. It's under promise, over deliver. Under promise, over deliver. That doesn't mean we're less honest. That doesn't mean we're less authentic, but it means we're realistic. And we're not trying to promise you the world, and we're not trying to promise you change within the first 90 days. But guess what? Because we are focused on the things that matter to you, over time, and typically in a shorter period of time, you should see us executing more, you should see us delivering more, and you should be happier about me being your governor as opposed to some other candidates who you may have selected. But it all goes back to the theme of our campaign, listening to Georgians. And that's what a lot of politicians aren't doing. To elect them, they're just simply duplicating previous policies or duplicating what big donors want or duplicating what lobbyists want. And it has nothing to do with the grassroots level of people who make up most of your constituents. And so as we are elected in 2026, we have this database of wishes from the people. And imagine on day one as a team saying, okay, this is what the people want. Let's go for it. And people will see results quickly.
I want to head more to the ethical side of things.
Yes.
I want to ask you, if everyone is created imago Dei, in the image of God, why do people do bad things?
It's an answer that I believe that will only be answered long after we're gone. Going to a biblical illustration in Corinthians, it says, we look through a glass dimly, but one day we will fully know. And I truly believe, and this is my Christian value, that there are some things that I'll only understand in heaven. And if I were able, in my line of work as a pastor, things that I've seen, things that I've heard, damage that has been done would break the hearts of so many people. It's like first responders, and that's why my heart breaks for them. And as a governor, I want to do everything I can for first responders, because when you're watching the news media, even on social media, you're probably seeing 30% of what they see. The other 70% will never make the news media, and it's things that will literally break your heart: evil, damage, hatred. And so the answer to that is unknown. Why do bad things happen? Why do people do bad things? We don't quite understand it. But what I do believe is that there is more good than bad. There's more hope in this world than evil. And regardless of being an elected official or any other leader in our world, focus on the good, focus on doing the most good. And I think we can always overcome the bad and the evil. And that's what I would do as the next governor of Georgia. And it's what I've done all my life.
I would actually argue that a lot of the reason people do bad things is it's a structural issue. And so a lot of those issues that you pointed to earlier, and I feel like you get a good grasp, going on public transport or going in an Uber or something like that and speaking to people or people that work at shops. Like I like speaking to people and asking them questions. And so you kind of get a much better picture of the things that are happening. And I can't imagine what it would be like, to not have enough money to be able to feed my kids or to do X, Y, Z. And I feel like that drives good people to do bad things. And so a lot of those core issues that we were talking about, that you mentioned that Georgians thought were important, I feel like if you fix those from the top down, it won't all be gone, but a lot of those issues are interconnected and will solve themselves.
Yeah, very much so. And so I am aware of systemic and social and structural evils and bad things that, if you look in particular United States of America, were very much baked into the founding of the country. People who looked like me from the Constitution weren't even fully human. And so if you start there, and even if you go down the road, it's still hard to overcome it. And so economically, academically, housing wise, community resources, a lot of people have been dealt a bad set of cards historically because of some of those structural evils and structural wrongs that, as you said, if we can address those, we can then address at a ground level many of the actions of the people.
Whilst I've kind of just asked this question, I still want to ask whether you think that people are naturally good or bad, or if you think that's the wrong question to even ask.
Well, I don't think it's a wrong question. It is a great debate and will be debated until the end of time. Going back to Jeremiah, before you were born, I knew you. It's hard for me to believe that God creates someone who's evil. I think people are nurtured and unfortunately born into certain circumstances that help to create a trajectory that isn't good. When we think about racism, children are born racist, but they're nurtured in family structures or communities that create that in them. And so those would be examples that I would go to when you go to a local hospital and you see all of these newborns. Those children aren't evil. But unfortunately, when they're home and whatever that environment looks like, the opportunity to go in one direction as opposed to another direction is nurtured into them. And that's so unfortunate.
You know, so if there is a heaven and there is a hell, or, you know, whatever it is, or purgatory, or whatever you believe there is, why does God even want us to live in the first place? Why not send us straight to a world with no suffering? I'm sure you've come across countless people who have lost limbs or lost family members in horrific ways. Why would a loving God even put us through all of that, or even go through this thing that we call life anyway?
Yeah. And that's a profound question. I believe in something theologically called free will, in that God allows us to take certain actions and make certain decisions, even if they're in total opposition to what God would want for our world and our society. The goodness that I see in our world is through the goodness of people who have historically been able to overcome evil, have been able to overcome harm and things that you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. But then also through the Christian perspective, my hope is in Christ, who is that ultimate sacrifice for all of our sins and all of the things that we've done and all of the things that we will do. So even as I experience and see the evil in the world, and I'll be the first to raise my hand to say I'm not perfect, and some of the bad I've caused, my hope is in Christ. And that regardless of what may happen in the world, truth, justice, hope, and mercy will overcome.
I liked your example of the faded, I think you said like the faded glass that will become more obvious to us over time.
We look through a glass dimly. Yeah.
We look through a glass dimly. But let's say, like, I just as much as anyone, you know, want a loving God. I want a heaven. I want all my everything to be solved, you know, just as much as I want the same for my neighbor. Yes. But why do you think we place so much trust in a figure that we've never met or never know about or have never seen? I know there's that thing about, you know, you've got to place your trust in God blindly and to receive his grace. But why place so much trust in him when what we do see is we see the good, but we also see the horrifically bad?
Yes. Well, one of the things that I've been able to do over the years is to author several books. And the latest book is Faith for Essential Practices. And I dedicated that book to my mother, who passed away last year. And out of all the books that I'd written, they were about entrepreneurship type church subjects. And she said, Olu, why don't you write a book for everyone? And so I really believe this is a book for everyone, because I struggle the most with faith. Every day of my life, it's a challenge. And as I talk to people as you do, regardless of your profession or background, that's one of the consistent struggles. In particular, having faith in this being that you don't see, but yet put so much trust in God. So for me, I believe, and I can only answer it from my perspective, I believe that God created us. I believe that God created the world. And I believe that God loves me. And I believe God is ultimately in control. And so it's easier for me to place my faith in God because of that belief. But it can be much harder for people who don't have that belief. But I also believe that our faith is strengthened and helped because we see the extensions of God. And when you see a rainbow in the sky on this cloudy day, and it may be the worst day of your life, but suddenly there's this rainbow. When a child comes up and hugs you and smiles and says, I love you, and it just melts all the hatred away. All of those are expressions and extensions of God, which ultimately strengthen my faith because I know that God created those things and God allows those things. So I can only answer it from my perspective and my journey related to faith.
You mentioned a minute ago that you believe in free will, whilst at the same time trusting in God that he will lead you to the right path. Yes. How do you balance the two of those? And then on top of, adjacently to that, what does God want?
It's a lot like politics. And so people think, Olu, are you really sure this is what you want to do? Because you're walking into so much diversity, so much hatred, so much individualism and people who are selfish. And I think about that theological image of free will. We can only control ourselves and we can only make the best decisions for ourselves. You think about it, you have siblings, you have family members who don't choose the things that you choose, but you still love them. And I believe that's the way God sees the world. I think it breaks God's heart when I choose something that God doesn't desire for me, but God doesn't love me any less. And I believe that is why I put my trust and faith in God, a creator who allows me to live my life in ways that God wouldn't necessarily choose for me and doesn't love me any less. And I think that's the way our society is. When we look at our world and we see people who choose differently than us, but we still can choose to love them. We may not like what they do. We may not approve of what they do, but I love you as a sister. I love you as a brother. And in reflection of a word and phrase from Dr. King, I believe that's an expression of what we call the beloved community. Not that we all agree, not that we all do the right thing all the time, but the beloved community is a community that makes space for all of God's children.
When looking at religion in terms of membership, participation over the centuries, when there's, things like World War I, World War II, there's a rise in religion as people look to God and they want to place their trust in something, in someone. And so there's an increase in participation. Unfortunately, for several family members and family friends, there have been instances when looking at the 1980s and 1990s in the UK there was a big problem of teachers, of church officials, and other sort of leaders who did not use their authority and their power in the right way, unfortunately leading to several grooming instances of people, or not necessarily them, but the people around them. So you've got the one hand of like rise in religion when you have horrific things going on, but then other horrific things going on that push people away. Have you got a message for those people that have looked up to and trusted people that have broken their trust, and how they can go about trusting their partner again, trusting their father, their mother, their brother, their coach, a future church leader, because not everyone is the same as them?
Well, for me, it would be that it breaks God's heart to see anyone hurt. And that is not the will of God. And that unfortunately, there are people, whether they be pastors or politicians, who have made certain decisions and taken on certain actions that God is not pleased with. And that you must understand, they do not represent the church in the way God would want them to. And for some of those politicians, they don't represent democracy in the way it was meant to. But that doesn't make you feel better. My hope for those individuals is that, going back to that faith question, that regardless of who the leader is of that local church or that denomination or that larger church body, you would always put your ultimate trust in God and not in men or not in women who are imperfect. And that does not excuse any of their actions. But unfortunately, we've seen church leaders do a lot of harm. And my hope is that those folks would be brought to justice and that the leaders who supervise them would have the courage enough to make sure that that form of behavior is eradicated from our places that represent God. And so the other question that you asked around times of war or times of tragedy, oftentimes people will go to church or places of faith or membership will rise. And I think that's a positive thing because it still says that the church is a place that people can trust. It also creates an opportunity for those faith communities, not just to be one-stop shops in times of trauma, but how do we look into the future and create long-term relationships with people who are experiencing trauma or acute trauma, but to help them to understand that this is a place that can be for you even when the world is going right for you. So it's an opportunity on both ends.
I have 3 final questions. The
Go
first
ahead.
the first one being, if I was to ask someone in 100 years,
Yes.
I was to ask someone, what was Olu Brown like? What would you want them to say?
Yeah. He was an ordinary guy with extraordinary dreams.
It's great. My penultimate one, and I think it's pretty obvious, but what's next for you?
So I retired from pastoral ministry about 2.5 years ago. I have my own business now, which is coaching and consulting, primarily faith leaders, but also people in the business community. So I'm still doing servant leadership, helping individuals optimize their own abilities and the organizations that they lead. And what's next for me is running for governor of Georgia, with the primary being May of 2026. And our hope is we win the primary and we go on to general election in November of 2026. So the hopeful next is you'll be able to say I had a podcast interview with Governor-elect Olu Brown.
Of course. And my final question, and I like to ask this to every guest, is what is one thing that you would want a listener to take away from this episode?
It's a quote that I heard that I would hope you would live by and that I live by. I would rather try and fail than never to have tried at all.
Wow, I love those 2 last things you said. I'm not often that stumped, but you can if you're watching the video version of this podcast, you can see me stumped. Honestly, I feel incredibly honored to speak to you today. I think you're one of the most articulate people I've probably ever spoken to. I think it's a real talent to be able to respond to a question, but then be able to respond to it with a story. It's why parents tell their kids stories from the minute they're born, is because it might not always, you might not always be able to understand a lesson or something firsthand, but if you can view something with external characters, it's a way that brings something to life in a way that will make you feel like the lesson taught was something that you learned yourself. I think your journey is fascinating, how you went from being young and being exposed to that church community to actually going about getting involved in it, starting your own one, and then building an enormous congregation of following. I wish you the very best in your career moving forward. I hope you do become governor. That is on the basis, for those listening, not on policies, but on character. And I hope you keep doing church differently. So thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.